Hola. Soy Mark Guiberson, un profesor de logopeda de la Universidad de Wyoming en los Estados Unidos. Viví un año aquí en el País Vasco, así que tengo una conexión especial con la gente de aquí. Trabajo con muchas familias en los Estados Unidos que son de México y también que son bilingües. Así que este es una de mis áreas de especialidad, trabajar con poblaciones bilingües. También mi especialidad es intervención temprana con niños con incapacidades y con niños que tienen pérdida auditiva. Trabajé 7 años en una escuela bilingüe en los Estados Unidos y llevo 14 años trabajando con familias bilingües en los Estados Unidos también. Voy a presentar 2 estudios que hice con familias de las comunidades autónomas de España. Me resulta más fácil presentar los estudios en inglés. Y también para que no se pierda el mensaje y información que quiero ofrecerles. Tengo un intérprete. Me encantaría hablar con ustedes después de la conferencia. Nacho, ¿cómo se avance? Derecho. Este no. Oh, ok, gracias. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about bilingualism in children with hearing loss. This is a topic that's really important to me. As soon as I graduated from my graduate program, I've got my first job in an early childhood center, and I loved it. And shortly after starting, I heard from the Department of Health in my state, and they asked me, would you work with children who are Spanish-speaking who also have hearing loss? And I said, absolutely. And over the next 8 years, I probably saw 25 children, Spanish-speaking, with hearing loss. And I'm going to present some of that to you today. But this has been a very important topic for me. Oh. This is the university that I work at. It looks like this for about 3 weeks out of the year. There's usually about a foot of snow on the ground. So this is probably the end of July. I'm going to talk to you about bilingualism, some frameworks for bilingualism. I'm going to talk to you about bilingualism and hearing loss. And then I'm going to talk to you about the 2 studies that I completed. And then we'll move into some recommendations. At least half the world's population is bilingual, and bilingualism is present in every country of the world. Bilingualism is very common across the Iberian Peninsula. There are a lot of languages and a lot of people in the Iberian Peninsula. I'm going to use the word bilingual to refer to spoken or oral languages. You could use that word also to include sign languages, but for this presentation, I will use that word to refer to oral or spoken languages. Bilingualism in Spain is not uncommon. National census data shows that 53% of adults report that they are bilingual or multilingual, with English being the most common spoken second language. And this corresponds with what we were hearing earlier from Nacho as well. All languages are valued, and English is a language of commerce that could be very useful to people who are looking for jobs. It provides for international opportunities. It's an important language. It's not surprising that in Madrid, 379 public schools have introduced bilingual programs. At the same time, in some regions of Spain, 68 to 100% of children enrolled in elementary schools are enrolled in some form of a bilingual program, and that may include autonomous community languages. So with all this movement towards bilingualism, and with bilingualism being so important, a lot of families and a lot of professionals are asking, what about with children with hearing loss? Can children with hearing loss be bilingual? Can they become bilingual? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So anything from learning English to learning an autonomous community language. Before we talk more about that, though, we need to talk a little bit about the frameworks of bilingualism. So how do we think about bilingualism? So there are two different frameworks that were described by Cummins. One has bilingual, or languages separated out, so that English is stored in one area and Spanish might be stored in a different area, or Basque might be stored in a different area. So the idea was that there's separate containers and they don't actually interact. Another model is that there's a common underlying proficiency, that all of these languages kind of interact and they exist together. There's no evidence to support the separate underlying proficiency, or the idea that languages are separated in our brains, but there is evidence that suggests that linguistic development is linguistic development, so that first and second languages support each other. And Cummins found this by looking at research specifically at children in California who were learning Spanish and English, and he looked at their literacy skills, and he saw that literacy skills in Spanish transferred over to English and vice versa. So we have reason to believe that languages support each other. They're not separate and they're not competing with each other. They actually support each other. So he came up with the interdependent hypothesis, and basically the hypothesis says that we can transfer linguistic skill from one language to another. So that what you learn in Castellano could also transfer to English or could transfer to Basque. These languages aren't completely separate. Linguistic development is linguistic development, and it supports all language development. And then since then, there's been more models that have been developed around bilingualism that have been applied specifically to children and individuals with disabilities, including this interactional dual systems model. So this model says, yes, there are two systems that are separate, but they also interact, or they interface. And so that information is transferred when it's needed, but the languages are separated adequately, but they can still receive the benefit from both languages. So in this way, the first language, and I use L1 for that, the first language and the second language, L2, they support each other. Well, what about bilingualism in deaf and hard of hearing children? Well, we know that there are 250 million individuals around the world who have moderate, severe to profound hearing loss. And we know that 50 to 67% of the world's population is bilingual. So we should expect that there's a sizable population that is both bilingual and deaf or hard of hearing. For these individuals, having more than one language is natural. It may be needed in order to be successful. We also know that parents are faced with some very difficult decisions when they discover that their children have a hearing loss, or that their child has a hearing loss. They're faced with decisions about communication and modality, and this can be very difficult. It's a difficult time. Families are often advised that deaf and hard of hearing children either cannot or should not become bilingual. And we heard that story from Dale just a moment ago. Decisions about mode of communication and decisions about if a child could or cannot become bilingual are made in the absence of knowledge about theories of bilingualism and about current research. And that's what I want to talk about next. But I guess our goal here is to really question the common assumption that deaf and hard of hearing children cannot or should not become orally bilingual. There's growing evidence that shows that, indeed, children with hearing loss can become bilingual. And I'm going to review two sources. The first one is a study that I wrote. It's a case study, and it's one of the first studies that looks at a child longitudinally, or over a couple of years, a child with a cochlear implant who was from a Spanish-speaking family living in the United States and who needed to become bilingual. And then the second study is a systematic review. So it's a review of recent studies. Okay, I'm going to tell you about, first about this case study. So the purpose of this study was to really determine, can children with cochlear implants become orally bilingual or spoken language bilingual? The history behind this particular study is that Julia, the child, came to the United States from Mexico at 10 months of age. Her hearing loss was discovered after meningitis when she was about 20 months of age, and she had a severe to profound hearing loss. Sign became the primary focus in her home with deaf speech language and deaf educators visiting the home. She received her implant shortly after her 5th birthday, which is pretty late for now. Nowadays, we would say, boy, that's a late implant. A little bit more about the languages being used. The implant center, in order to consider Julia a candidate for an implant, they asked the family to promise that they would not use Spanish with their child. Despite the fact that the parents didn't speak English, they asked them not to speak Spanish. The speech therapist, that was me, I disagreed. And I said that I think the family should speak what feels natural. So since I was going into the home and providing the services, I supported the family in continuing to use Spanish. Most of the family spoke Spanish, but Julia's father and also her sisters were beginning to speak some English, and they also signed some. In terms of her intervention program, the school was teaching her in English only. Her literacy was taught in English. She had the use of a sign language interpreter initially, and she received private speech language services with me once a week in the home or at a center. The services that I provided were in English, so I taught her in English, and her parents wanted a home program to complete the same activities in Spanish at home. So they became the therapist every day, or they did the in-home therapy with her in Spanish. I provided therapy in English at the center or in the home initially. So the idea behind a home program is that I would give listening activities or speech activities that would be completed in Spanish, because that was what the family spoke. And I will have already taught those things in English during my private session or during my sessions. Initially, her home environment included sign language, but over time that was dropped out because she didn't need that anymore. She was developing speech and auditory skills, so she no longer needed additional sign language. This is what Julia's data looks like. Let me advance the slide. And this is her ability, her speech perception ability, or her listening skills, her auditory skills. So initially, she understood about 4 out of 12 words, and then within a year, she was understanding about 10 out of 12 words. And by 41 months, she had moved on to a different set of words that were more complicated and longer, and she was understanding about 19 out of 24. So she was making nice advancement in her auditory skills. She also was making some really nice advancement in her language skills, and she was becoming bilingual. She was independently communicating with her family members in Spanish. She also her Spanish language development did not result in a loss in her English language skills. So this is an important point because many people think that if somebody learns a second language, it's at the cost of another language. We saw that she continued to develop both her Spanish and her English skills, and that neither of them suffered. 3 years after her implant, she was very sophisticated at turning to different conversational partners and using the appropriate language. So she knew when to use Spanish, she knew when to use English. this case really demonstrates that children who are bilingual, or children who are deaf, hard of hearing with an implant, they have the potential to become bilingual in spoken languages. This also was one of the first studies to show that professionals should really consider these options. Instead of limiting options for children and families, we should consider multiple options for them. And we should also be thinking about bilingual schools, how to support languages in the home, or other services that can help flesh out the language environment. I just want to give you a little update on Julia. So she's not a 5-year-old anymore. This is her at her quinceañera party. This is her family. Her father's dressed in a very traditional way, but this was a very big day for her, and she invited me to her party, and she spoke in front of everyone at a microphone and sounded beautiful, sounded perfect. And then I also saw her conversing with her tias and with her grandma. She's a bilingual person living in a bilingual world, and she has a whole lot of ability. And even since this last week, I found out that she's graduating from high school and that she's already taking some college courses, individual college courses. She's an absolute success, in my opinion, and her family is very proud of her. She's Spanish-English bilingual. So I've always been really interested in these populations because I think people are quick to say, you can't do that, they can't do that. And now I can say, yeah, actually, I've got a really good story I can tell you where we can do that. We can offer that to them. So related to this, I wanted to look at the next study. And this next study is a review of multiple studies. So these researchers combed over a handful of studies, and I'm going to tell you how they did it in a moment. But the neat thing about this type of research is that they can find trends. So you might be thinking, yeah, but Julia, she was special, or boy, Julia had a great situation. So it helps if we can do a systematic review to show that there's multiple studies showing that this is true, this is working. So this is a group of Australian researchers that I'm familiar with, and I want to share with you their research. So they wanted to review the literature internationally and see, are there cases of bilingual children with either cochlear implants or hearing aids that are successful? So they looked over 117 studies published between 2000 and 2010, and they found that there were 100 of those 117 studies of children with cochlear implants or hearing aids that were non-English speaking. Only 8 of those studies described bilingual children or described the development of 2 languages in those children. So their results are based upon 8 of those studies, and I just presented one of them to you. So this is a growing area of research. We need more research in this area. So what did they find? They looked over these 8 studies of children who are bilingual and deaf and hard of hearing, and they found that children were able to develop language skills in both languages. They were able to become bilingual. They also found that the development in each language was really dependent upon how much and how rich their exposure to each of those languages was. So it really mattered how much they were exposed to English or how much they were exposed to Spanish and how rich that was. So this is going to be something that we talk more about because it turns out to be pretty important. We can't expect people to become bilingual automatically. We need to take into account how rich and how often are they being supported in those languages. So the bottom line is more exposure to the language, more linguistic skill in that language. Some other things that they found which are important, and that we've also seen this in typically developing hearing children, is that the age at which children are exposed to languages matters. So age matters, we know this. If the acquisition was simultaneous, if it occurred at the same time, or if it was sequential, that matters as well. If children were exposed to speech and writing in both languages, that turns out to be important too. And what was each language used for? Was Were they used just for things around the house, like pick that up, sit at the table, bring me something? Or was it really rich language that occurred? And then other things that are important include looking at what languages were parents using, what languages were teachers using, what languages do these communities use naturally, and what languages do friends use, our peers use. So in summary, from the study from Sharon McLeod and her colleague, what they have found is that caregivers may be advised by well-intentioned professionals to limit a child's exposure to one language. And we've talked about this. It's not uncommon for this conversation to occur where families are led to, you need to pick one language for your child. But our outcomes that we've seen so far are showing us that children who are deaf and hard of hearing are indeed capable of becoming bilingual. And they're also showing that the more exposure and the better exposure these individuals have, the better their language outcomes will be for both languages. Well, we've got some pretty good research. We've got a good start, and we have a lot further to go. But I was really motivated. I came here 2 years ago, and I really became motivated. I met many families from t-oigo.com, and I got really interested in your stories and really curious about what's going on here. And I thought about Spain as really a multilingual country and just the richness of the people in Spain. And I also was really seeing the interest in English and other languages. So that really motivated me to complete this study. And I have to thank Dale for all of her help in t-oigo.com for helping me make this happen. So I was able to complete 2 studies. And both of them were published this year. One of them came out this month, in October, I mean, in Cochlear Implants International. And the other one's in the American Journal of Audiology. How many of you are thinking, he put a study of Spanish families or families from Spain in an American journal? Why? Well, it's important here in Spain, but it's important on a global level. And I keep looking for evidence to share with professionals in the United States about this is the way they do it in other countries. This is the way families manage bilingualism in other countries. So this is a really important topic that has national and global implications. That's why it showed up in American Journal. Okay, let me talk about the 2 studies with you. The first one was really looking at parents and in Spain and the decision-making factors, or how did they make decisions, both about communication modality and also about bilingualism. So the first part was that I wanted to describe the factors and trends with parents' choice of communication. I wanted to see who was helping make those decisions and where did families get support from other people. I also wanted to look at the bilingual variables and see, do bilingual variables predict if children will be raised bilingually or not by their parents? And I wanted to do that here because bilingualism is common. There's a lot of opportunity for bilingualism in this country. There's way more opportunity here than there is in my country. Okay, so let's talk about the families that participated. So there were 71 families from Spain. 13 of the 17 different autonomous communities were represented, and I'll show you who participated in terms of regions of Spain in a moment. 40% of the families were from the autonomous community of Madrid, so we had a lot of families from the Madrid area. And then 24% of them were from regions of Spain where other languages are frequently spoken. In terms of the children, most of the children had severe to profound hearing loss. 69% of them had received a cochlear implant, and 32% of them had received a second cochlear implant. And I thought that was really high based on my practice in the United States. 56% of the parents selected an oral-only mode of communication, and 24% selected oral plus sign, and 20% selected cued speech. Okay, we'll look at some tables. Okay, so this is where the families came from. You can see some of them weren't as well represented as others, but we definitely have Galicia, País Vasco, where there's a lot of other where there are autonomous community languages, and nicely spread across Spain, across the peninsula. Here's information on the children. So they were pretty well split between a few more males than females. A lot of children under the age of 5, smattering of children between 6 and 10, and then also 11 to 18. There's that same information I told you about device usage. So 69% used implants, 49% used hearing aids, and then hearing loss information, and then mode of communication. So, I wanted to look at mode of communication to see if there were any differences in the way families made decisions about bilingualism or about who was giving the family the most support or where they were looking for support. So children with profound hearing loss were approximately equal represented across the oral-only group, the oral plus sign group, and the cued speech group. There was a higher percentage of children in the cued speech group who had bilateral cochlear implants. 38% of the sample of the children were bilingual, based on parent reports. So 38% of the children were bilingual, with a slightly lower percentage of children in the cued speech being bilingual, but it wasn't a significant difference. Okay, here's that same information, hearing loss, mode of communication information, and then bilingualism on the bottom. Okay, one of the goals of the study was to look at the decision-making factors. Who was helping make decisions for families, or where were families looking for support in making decisions? So parents reported that spouses and partners, as well as grandparents, were the most supportive and the most involved in decision-making. Other family members were also involved, as were other families of children with hearing loss. There was no big difference across groups in terms of how families looked for support for making these decisions. So no big surprises there. Next, I wanted to look at, well, what about professional support? Were there any differences in terms of how do professionals support families in making these decisions? Across the groups, speech-language pathologists were the most supportive and most involved in the decision-making process. Other groups that were very involved included audiologists and deaf educators and special educators. And then other professionals were less involved, including medical as well as school principals were less involved. So we didn't see there were no differences across the groups in terms of who was supporting making decisions. I was really interested in this information. So 49% of the families indicated that they had to work hard to find information about options for their children. So 49% of the families, half of the families, said they really had to work hard to find information for their children. 54% of the families said they wished that professionals had told them about more options for their children. So again, a large proportion reported that they wanted to know, first they had to look hard, but they also wanted more options than were presented to them. 71% of the parents indicated the type of services provided in school was an important factor. So what's going on in school shaped what their decisions were about mode of communication and bilingualism for their children. And then another variable that was important for about 40% of the families included how close were the services to the home. So that turned out to be important for some of the families too. The next set of variables I was really interested in were the bilingual variables. So 38 of the parents had one of the, 38% of the families had one parent who was bilingual. 8 of those families spoke an autonomous community language. 19 spoke a foreign language, with English being the most common. So that kind of sounds like, I was looking around when you were raising your hands, and I saw a lot of hands go up when people asked if you spoke English, and some of you were a little bit going up. In terms of the children, 38% of the children were bilingual, but I want to stop right here. The 38% of children who were bilingual were not the exact same 38% of the parents who were bilingual. So having a bilingual parent didn't mean that you automatically were going to be bilingual, or your parent wouldn't have chosen that necessarily. Although it turns out to be important. 12 of those children spoke an autonomous community language, and 15 spoke a foreign language, again with English being the most common. Of the 27 bilingual parents, only 16 of them decided to raise their child bilingually. This was really interesting to me. The beliefs around bilingualism were really uniform across the families, so that 80% of the parents indicated that they believed being bilingual for any child was a really good thing, a really important thing. So 80% of the families said bilingualism is good, and children get a better education when they're raised bilingually, and they're more prepared to work and be employed when they're bilingual. And then 70% of the families indicated that they believed that children with hearing loss were capable of becoming orally bilingual. That's good news too. But it doesn't match, because only 38% of the families chose a bilingual option for their children. Gotta hang on to this. Okay. I was curious, were there people telling them, no, don't raise your child bilingually? 50% of the families were encouraged to raise their child bilingually, and only 36% of the families were discouraged from raising their child bilingually. I wanted to look closer at those bilingual variables now that I've described them to you. So I looked specifically at the child's bilingual score. Does your child understand another language? Does your child speak another language? And then I also looked at the parent's bilingual score, which included things like, do you speak, do you understand, or does the child's other parent speak or understand? Or were they educated for 5 years or more in another language? I also wanted to look at parents' beliefs about bilingualism, as we talked about that a little bit, and about raising children bilingually. So, just to kind of back up, I wanted to see if parents selected that their children or their child would be raised bilingually. I wanted to see, well, how closely is this associated with these different variables? So it was significantly associated with the parent's bilingual status. It was also related to beliefs about raising a child, a deaf or hard of hearing child, bilingually. And it was also related to if a parent had received encouragement to raise their child bilingually. So it appears that these three things are related in some way to a parent's decision to raise their child bilingually. I was curious then, what would happen if we combine those variables all together? How much of this could account for parents' decisions around bilingualism? So I completed some analyses looking at these bilingual variables. If we put them all together, how much of these three variables could account for if a child is raised bilingually or not? So when they were combined, these three variables predicted parents' decisions around bilingualism. So these three things turned out to be pretty important. So I completed this study in Spain. It's a linguistically rich country. These findings indicate that when parents are bilingual, when they believe that deaf and hard of hearing children can become bilingual, and when they are supported by other people, they will make a decision to raise their child bilingually. So this is helpful for me when I'm working with others in other countries. This is good information. It tells me what sort of things influence decision-making around bilingualism. This study also adds on to earlier studies showing us that bilingualism is an option. We need to present it to families. We can expect that the amount, the quantity, and the quality of language exposure will still have an impact on language development in both languages, though, and we should keep that in mind and be realistic. Okay, so this led me to the second study. For this study, I really wanted to compare the first and second language skills of bilingual children, and the first thing I wanted to do is this first little bullet, which was establish that, I keep wanting to walk away from the microphone, but then I come back, because this is what makes my voice carry. Okay, the first thing I wanted to do was kind of iron out that when children learn a second language, it's not at the cost of the other language. It's not at the cost of the first language, because that is the argument that people are using. If you teach him Spanish, it's going to take away from his English. He's not going to do as well. If you teach him French, it's going to take away from his Spanish. So it's kind of like this subtractive model. You're taking something away, the idea that these languages are competing. So the first idea was to really compare those first language skills of children living in Spain, of a group of deaf and hard of hearing children who were bilingual to a group of deaf and hard of hearing children who were monolingual Spanish speaking. And then the second thing I wanted to do was really describe that second language proficiency as best I could through the parent survey, because other studies haven't really described how proficient children become in a second language, and it's probably the next good step. And then I also wanted to know, how are these children becoming bilingual in Spain? How are they doing that? And I also wanted to know, how satisfied are these parents with their child's bilingual development? How satisfied are they with how this is going? So for this study, I had 51 parents from the previous study who were invited to participate, or who hit the continue button and continued with the survey. It was also through a website. These families were invited through t-oigo and also other websites or schools. They were parents of children between the ages of 3 and 18, and the children had no other identifiable disabilities. So they completed the survey online, and they completed the they completed the structured oral language observation matrix. I'm going to show it to you in a moment. Okay, this is it. So if you completed the survey, you've seen this before, and I know some folks did participate in the survey. So what this does is it looks at language domains of comprehension, fluency, vocabulary, and pronunciation and grammar, and then it rates how well an individual has developed those skills. So that first column is a real basic level, the column in the middle is a more intermediate level, and the last column, column 5, is a really advanced level for each of those skills. All right, so I had the big question, how did the monolingual children compare to the bilingual children? But before I made that comparison, I had to make sure that there were no differences in terms of age, degree of hearing loss, or implant status. And there were no differences. The groups were the same that way. So they were the same age, they roughly had the same amount of children with cochlear implants, and the same type of hearing loss was seen. So then I compared the two groups. I wanted to see, this is the big question, did the children who were raised bilingually, was their first language lower than the children who were raised monolingually? And it wasn't. In fact, my results showed that they were higher, and they were significantly higher. That was a surprise. The next question I had was about their proficiency. And we saw a range of proficiency. So that tool that we looked at with the matrix a moment ago, if we add all of those up, they map onto a level of language proficiency. And it ranges from pre-production to speech emergence, to more advanced proficiency on the very bottom. So what I saw was that there was a lot of children who were just beginning to speak a second language or just beginning to develop those skills. And there was a sizable amount who were in the intermediate to advanced range as well. But there definitely was a range. In terms of, the other question I had was about where are these children getting exposure to a second language? They were getting exposure from both parents and from school. And then that last question I had was about how satisfied are these parents with their children's bilingual ability. 52% indicated that their child's second language abilities were better than they had expected. And 28% indicated that their child's abilities were about where they had expected. So, these findings. Well, I found that children who were raised bilingually who were deaf or hard of hearing, had first language skills that were stronger from this particular sample than their monolingual peers. This finding is consistent with a large body of research that is starting to show us that children who are deaf or hard of hearing are capable of learning two languages. These findings could point to the idea of bilingual benefit. So instead of thinking of a second language competing with another language, it could be that being bilingual, you can transfer skills, you can have a benefit because you have more linguistic ability. And that's the idea that we talked about earlier with cross-linguistic transfer. So there could be a really natural benefit to being bilingual. We also saw that second language proficiency really varied, with 60% of the children in that pre-production or early production stage and 40% of the children in speech emergence to advanced stages. In terms of parent satisfaction, 80% of parents said that their child's second language abilities were better than they had expected or about at the level they had expected. So that's pretty good. Well, there's a couple limitations we should talk about with this study. First, it's based upon parents' ratings of their children. So it's based purely upon parents' perceptions or ratings. It would be better if we could get right down in there and do some language testing as well. Oops, excuse me. Even so, there's a handful of studies right now showing us that these parent ratings with this tool, they're accurate. They're actually accurate. Another shortcoming is that we ask parents to rate the second language, and sometimes the parent didn't speak the second language, so that was problematic. It meant that they were looking for information from other sources. And then the last question I asked about parents' expectations. Earlier, Dale said something like every child is a world. Well, every parent and every family is a world too. So everybody's had a different set of experiences as well. So this expectations is kind of a difficult thing to measure. It's kind of fuzzy in some ways. What would be a good next step for this line of research? Well, actually, I have colleagues in Texas who just completed a study that was published this month, and it's looking at that same question I had, which was, do children who are bilingual, does their first language suffer? And these individuals from Texas were looking at Spanish-English bilingual children, and they found that there was no difference in the first language skills of children who were being raised bilingually. So their first language did not suffer because they learned a second language. So that is refreshing. What would be nice to do next is to complete studies that include more direct child assessment. So more studies like this, and maybe looking at children who've been implanted and then have been systematically enrolled in a bilingual education program or other programs like Allies in English, and seeing how do these children respond, or how does their language change over time. Okay, I have some recommendations in this last part. The first set of recommendations are around second language development. And then I'll have some recommendations about general auditory development. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about allies in English too. And then I think we're going to have time for questions. Yeah? No? 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to, as they say in Wyoming, I'm going to giddy up and go. This is what I do when I teach children. I really try to tap into their interests. What do they find most interesting? What do they want to learn about? Let's do that. Let's make that the speech and language work. I make experience books. I like to really capture experiences that we made and then be able to reflect back on them. So photo books or blogs. I've used something called KWL, or here it's SQA. What does a child want to know? What do you want to know? You like butterflies? You want to know about butterflies? Okay, what do you know about butterflies? I scribe it, I write it down. And then what do you want to know? We develop some questions, we go out and do some research together, we make it fun, and then we make a book. And then we can revisit that repeatedly, or it can go home, or it can be something that you look at with grandma. Here are some just general points. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. Use a natural and slow rate of speech when you're talking with children who have hearing loss. When needed, emphasize missed words. So just put a little bit more emphasis. Still make it nice, it's still you, but there's a little bit more emphasis there. At first, you keep your sentences short, and then gradually, as they respond, they grow. The idea of an auditory sandwich is that you say something 3 times. So I did a unit on butterflies with a student, and the word was, oh, the caterpillar sleeps in a chrysalis, or a cocoon. The caterpillar sleeps in a cocoon. The caterpillar sleeps in a cocoon. 3 times. They heard it 3 times, they store it, they map it. It's much more likely that they're going to be able to retrieve it and use it later. When a word is not understood, you just repeat it. Or maybe you repeat a synonym or a similar word. That means this. That's the same as this. So you teach vocabulary. It's natural. And then the last point is telling stories and retelling stories. Retelling stories is a great skill that children are going to need through adulthood, the ability to tell a story and relay events. So this is a great skill to work on. This is a resource. This is going to be posted later on t-oigo.com. These are some excellent resources around classroom acoustics from the American Speech Hearing Association. You should check them out. They're very good. But they can help you refine the classroom so that it's an auditory-friendly environment for learning. And then briefly, I'm going to tell you about Allies in English. This is a program. The goal is to increase exposure to English for children who are deaf and hard of hearing in a friendly way, in a fun way, to create cross-cultural learning for foreign exchange students who are American and these families, and then also to develop an emotional bond in learning another language. So it's really motivating to learn or do something when you're connected to a person, and that was one of the goals behind this too. Some of the child requirements: children need to be between the ages of 5 and 12. Sorry about that. Should I giddy up and go even faster? Okay. The children need to have pretty good results with their hearing technology. So they need to be responding to their hearing technology. They need to be developing speech in their native language. And oral language needs to be their primary language. The family really needs to understand the objective of the program. So the objective of the program is not tutoring, it's about having natural language exposure and engaging children in learning language with a native speaker. Also, the parents must be present at all times and participate. And they need to be able to treat the volunteer as a family member, to include them that way. And their homes need to be accessible through public transportation. Okay, the student volunteers, there's a bunch of them in the room. They need to be native English speaking. They have to commit to that full semester, 1 to 2 hours a week. They have to be willing to travel to the home, and they need to understand their role. Their role is to really be a natural, friend who speaks English with the child during these kind of fun activities. It's not a tutor role. Okay, the program activities really vary upon the child's interest and the volunteer's interest. It could be a whole lot of different things that they engage in. But before the volunteers even get started, they get to experience what does a hearing aid look like. They get to watch some videos of what the program has looked like as well. There's also semester events. It could be a Halloween festival or party. It could be a talent show. It could be a cooking party. And then many times, these events are covered by the media so that the public can get an idea of people with hearing loss and about their capabilities and things that they can do, and sort of a positive portrayal of hearing loss, help bringing down any barriers around hearing loss. Session activities really vary. They could be anything that children are interested in and that the volunteer is interested in. We can ask some of the volunteers later what they've been up to, but it could be really any of those things. And then also blogging is part of this experience so that there's kind of archived and you can go back and look at it with other family members or keep that information. Both the students and the families could be blogging. How do families respond? What are we hearing from families? 93% of the families have indicated that they would pay for this service. So that tells me that they're happy with how it's going. 75% of the families participated in program events like those parties, those semester parties. Families are reporting that they really see their children are motivated to learn English, that this is more motivating than the way they've been learning English in the classroom, or maybe it supplements that in a really nice way because now it means something. There's a personal relationship. Parents are reporting that they're convinced that their child can learn a second language despite their hearing loss. So this is very positive. They become more optimistic and confident that their child can learn a second language. And also another benefit is that parents and families are more open to foreign exchange students relating to the world and to volunteerism. Okay, here's just a couple notes from families. I'll let you take a peek at it, but very positive. More information from families, very positive. Families thought at first, my child may not be able to do that, but then later they discovered, yes, they can do this. This is motivating my child to learn a second language. This has been a very enriching experience. I like the last point. My child's more interested in learning a second language and learning English. Okay, and this is from our student volunteers, our university volunteers, our foreign exchange students, our foreign students. They're what this basically says is, I'm connecting to this family. I'm learning about hearing loss. I feel a connection. I feel something strong about this whole experience. So this is a very positive portrayal. Okay. Allies in English is expanding. So in 2013, there are programs in Madrid, Toledo, Valencia, Vigo, and Zaragoza. And then there are plans for future expanding of the program to areas including possibly Barcelona, Burgos, Bilbao, Valladolid, as well as Argentina. What's really important for the success of these programs is that there's natives, local natives, who can be a contact person and help organize students and coordinate the program. There also needs to be public transportation, and it probably works better in a city where there's more families, more university students. Okay, I would like to thank Dale Sandell again for putting this together in t-oigo.com, and then also our sponsors that are listed here for their generous support. I've got 5 minutes. I would love it if you had any questions, and you could ask me in Spanish. I would probably understand you, and if not, I'd get some help. Wow, no questions? You guys are easy. I wish my students were like this. Like, wait a second, mister. Yes?
It's normal that at the beginning, when the child needs to speak English, they are afraid about English.
Is it normal that that should happen? I think it's learned. I think we are taught to be afraid to speak another language. And I think it's normal because we teach them to be afraid. But I think it depends on personality too, and some children may take a little bit longer to warm up. That's why something like this we're going to play a game in English. We're going to do something you like to do already, that this really warms them up to it a lot. It can be intimidating in a class that's very structured. I mean, we need to learn that way too. You need both to really make rich learning happen. But I think it's normal. It's something that we're taught. What other questions do you have? Yes?
Did you mention the American Association to help working with the kids before finishing? Did you mention that?
Did I mention the American Association to help prepare the student volunteers, you mean, or?
In the school, when you're teaching both using Spanish and English, you said some tools to, you didn't mention.
The tools for teaching? I think that was in the slide where I talked about general strategies for second language teaching. I'd be happy to look at those with you after, or I could back up if you like. I just talked, let's back them up really quick. Yeah, this is what I did and if you have a more specific question, I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. I would love to talk to any of you afterwards. What other questions do you guys have? Boy, here's a foreigner in a foreign place telling you about how important your families are and how important your children and your decisions are. I just want to say thank you for participating, for all the families who participated. And thank you for thinking about this important topic, because this is opportunity for children. It's so important. In the context where I live, it's not even a choice. But if I had the choice, I would definitely choose this for my children or my niece or my nephew. So any other questions from any of you? Oh, right here.
One of the variables that you mentioned was the learning, whether it was sequential or simultaneous of the second language.
Yes.
You didn't actually show any evidence of what the impact is of that variable.
Yeah, and actually, we barely have enough information about typically developing children on simultaneous versus sequential. So simultaneous children learn both languages from birth or a very early age, before the age of 2. And sequential, they get exposed age 3, 4, 5, or 18. We don't have a lot on that, even in typically developing children or children who are hearing. We're just barely starting to poke at that. So it's a good point. We don't have that much. I didn't collect that much data on that. I couldn't through the survey. The other thing I didn't collect that I should have would have been how long has your child been exposed to a second language? Because that could have explained why there were so many in the early proficiency stage. Also, the children were pretty young, right? A lot of them were under the age of 5, over 50%, I think. I can't remember. But that's a very good point. Well, thank you so much. I would love to talk to you more afterwards, after we're finished here. Thank you.